How we receive the faith determines to a large degree how we share the faith. Nations evangelize as a function of how they were evangelized. Should we be surprised, for example, when 30 Filipino Christians get thrown into jail for chucking Bibles over the walls? Where did they learn that stuff? Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to the Philippines. They learn it from the West. Folks, if we get our message wrong, there's a long-term impact even until the third and fourth generation. It is going to take a long time to get bad methodology leached from the soil of what should be good motivation. Thirdly, we're motivated by the first rule of global engagement to do no harm. Do no harm. One of the ways to harm something is to stay too long. Let me use the example of Laos. This country of Laos has been highly impacted and positively impacted by missionaries from the West. And the seeds of the church literally have sprung from the blood of the martyrs. We have seen that when we've traveled together in Laos. And today there is an indigenous church that has flourished, that has been tried, that has been tested in Laos, and the gates of hell have not prevailed against it. Today they also have some internal strife. Christians do this to one another. Ethnic, ecclesial control, all that kind of stuff. It's going to have to be solved inside the church, inside Laos. But the larger problem, the largest problem in Laos today in terms of evangelizing that country comes from the secretive church. The folks who come in from the outside, the tent makers, missionaries under disguise. Now, they're well-intentioned, but folks, they're dangerous to the indigenous church that has already carved out its visibility in that country. The government knows they're there. They're aware of where they work. They're offended by how they got into the country. They talk to me about these folks. Why would they do that? Why would they lie? And you know, there may come a day when these guys are thrown out of Laos. And I can tell you what's going to happen, because this is the way it always happens. When someone is thrown out of a country, there's an international cry about all the persecution that's going on in the country of Laos. And when that day comes, that indigenous church, that fragile, small indigenous church, will feel even more alone. We need to keep faith with a remarkably resilient, visible expression of the body of Christ in Laos, and avoid the secretive nature of an imported religion, or we may irreparably harm that church. So do no harm. My final M. Ultimately, much of this, of course, is going to deal with methodology. Bad methodology will erode good message any day of the week. And we need to be as sophisticated as possible with each. How do we methodologically engage this issue of evangelism so that the message endures while minimizing the possibility of persecution? Now, hopefully you will hear this again and again throughout this conference. But certainly the very first thing that we have to do, I think, and the most important, is to embrace the incarnational model of Jesus Christ. The Word became flesh and established a presence. The Word became flesh and literally pitched his tent with us. Very little of importance takes place from a distance. When's the last time you hugged your wife from a distance? When's the last time you kissed your kids from a distance? It's not very effective. It doesn't work out very well. You got to be there. The ministry of presence. And the ministry of presence is especially important in those countries where you cannot openly proclaim the gospel, where you have to be silent. And in those places, you're going to be the only Jesus that somebody ever sees, let me tell you. And it's going to be your testimony, your personal behavior, your behavior that provokes the questions for which Jesus Christ is ultimately the answer. In those places, you are going to have to develop the worth of the gospel until such a time as the truth of the gospel might emerge. This comes from presence. This is kind of what St. Francis meant when he said, preach the gospel every chance you get. Use words if necessary. By the way, if you ever give that quote in a seminary, they're crestfallen. You know, they just spent $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in homiletics class. Preach the gospel every chance you get. Use words if necessary. Remember when John's disciples came to Jesus and Jesus said to them, you tell John what you have seen and heard. There is always a role for proclamation. There's always a role for preaching and teaching and discipling. These are major components in this exercise of evangelism. My only point here is that none of these things can most effectively be done at a distance. You got to be there. And as much as is possible, we need to pitch our tent with these folks. Secondly, where possible, always enter through the front door. Be clear as to how you can help. Be clear in terms of who you are. Be absolutely clear in terms of your institutional identity. The remarkable thing about everything that Christ says in the New Testament, so much of it is about his identity. He was crystal clear. I mean, it got him killed, but he was crystal clear. It was important for him to be crystal clear. And with us, as we go into places like this. When I was with World Vision, we would go into a country and start a protocol in terms of what we could bring, what we could do, what they needed. We would never leave the discussion until we would say at the end, by the way, if you want our best work, in addition to medical training and education, if you want our best work, you will let us work with the church. Don't hide anything. Be upfront. Be candid. If you want our best product, this is who we are. Be aware of what a covert approach can do to a young church once found out. Third, respect the people in the country. And this is people at every level. People in the government and people in the church. Respect them. We started IGE 5+ years ago. The mantra at IGE is understand your own faith at its deepest and richest best, and enough about your neighbors in order to respect it. Respect it. Respect it. I hate the word tolerance. All the international covenants talk about tolerance. And some of you, I'm sure, have heard me say this because I say it ad nauseum. Tolerance to me is a cheap form of grace delivered to somebody I don't especially care for. I don't like you, but I will tolerate you. It takes things to a lower common denominator. It suggests forbearance, not equality. Respect, on the other hand, brings us to those things that we mutually have in common, like the fact that each of us has been created in the image of God. And these are things that we can celebrate, and respect helps to take us there. Respect the people in the country. Fourth, use common sense. I love what Jesus said when he sent his people out into a chaotic, difficult world where they were going to experience a lot of problems, and they're supposed to be telling him this message of the kingdom. He says, look, this is what I want you to be. I want you to be as innocent as a dove, compassionate, sensitive, humble, a good listener. Our seminaries produce these folks like they're going out of style. And I want you to be shrewd as a snake. Most seminaries don't come close to producing people who are commonsensical, who are practical, who are pragmatic, who understand the way the world works and how they might have to operate not as compromise, but as shrewd people in the world. You know, I was in the State Department. We had this situation where a missionary couple from the West got in trouble in Laos. And they were put in jail for a couple of days, and then they were sent packing. This is what they did. They went to Laos, and they had 3 days of meetings, so they got a permit to talk for 3 days to the Lao Indigenous Church. Things were going so well, they decided to stay for a 4th day. You don't do that in a communist country. Your permit says 3, you don't go to 4. They went to 4, and then they were talking on that 4th day about the access that we enjoy with a holy and righteous God. And they wanted to put it in a context for the people to understand, and they did something that all of us do over and over again. Anybody that talks a lot does this. They said, look, Compare this with the lack of access that you have with the Prime Minister of Laos. Innocent. Not very shrewd. And there was a minder at the site. He took the word back to the party that these folks were criticizing the communist government. And the 2 Western Michigan missionaries were sent packing. But the 13 Christian Lao were put in jail for a year. A country where they still use wooden stocks. 13 people would spend a year in jail because there is a relationship between methodology and persecution. Finally, the incarnational model calls us to bear witness to hope. Peter says we're not like those who have no hope. I'm not sure if Peter said this. This is what Peter said after someone else said, we're not like those that have no hope. Peter said, bear witness. Bear witness to the hope that lies within you. You call yourself a Christian, this is what you do. You name the name of Christ, this is who we are. This should be our core competency, to bear witness to the hope that lies within us. Now, the thing about hope, it's future directed. It's out there somewhere. We're not sure how to bring it here unless we do things that are tangible today that point forward to that preferred future with credibility and legitimacy. You know that interesting story within the larger story of Jeremiah, the city's surrounded, the pagan Babylonians about to come over the walls, and everything is going to be different for the next 70 years. They're going to be carted off into exile and so on. In the middle of that, in the middle of the worst, darkest years of that siege, God says, hey, Jeremiah, we say we go out and look at some real estate. Take along an accountant, bring a lawyer. No matter how tough things get, there's always work for accountants and lawyers. Bring some money. We're going to pay for this thing with cash. Have some witnesses. Get it sealed. Why in the world would you do that? Because my people will return. In 70 years, God says, my people will return, and when they return, they will rebuild their homes. They will reconstitute their vineyards. There's nothing more tangible than food and housing. And during those very dark days for 70 years out there with the Babylonian pagans, I want them to know that there is hope and it's legitimate. They're coming home because we're buying this piece of land today. My dad was 75 years old when he went out back and he planted a bunch of little fruit trees about this high. And I went out to him and I said, mockingly, I have to confess, Dad, you've got to be the biggest optimist in the world. You're 75. You're planting these little bitty fruit trees. My dad died 10 years ago. And now when I go home to Harmony, New Jersey, I've got a choice to make. I can go up to that cemetery on top of Harmony Hill and brood over his grave, or I can pick the fruit of the tree and reflect on someone who knew a great deal about hope. Our King understands hope. There's a kingdom that has come. And there's a kingdom that is coming. The already and the not yet. The things that have happened already are tangible. He came, he taught, he lived, he died, he was resurrected, he ascended, he promised to come again, and that promise can be taken to the bank because he did it once, and the hope is secure that someday the full flowering of that kingdom will come to pass. This is the most attractive part of our faith. And this is also the part of our faith that makes our faith most secure even in the very tough places of the world. We need to conclude. Let me tell you a story through a Newsweek Time article that was written several years ago. about Bible smugglers. Bible smugglers would go into China, and they would saturate villages with Bibles and tracts. This is another variation of punt, pass, and kick using a Bible. And the Chinese leader, the leader of the house church where this was taking place, begins to comment on this methodology. He says the smugglers bomb a town in China during the night with scriptures, stuffing tracts into bicycle baskets and mailboxes so that, in the words of the smugglers, when the people woke up the next morning, there was Jesus everywhere. This Christian leader goes on with some passion to contradict this assumption. He says, no, Jesus was not everywhere. Because Jesus is not a book. The Bible is not Jesus. There must be a context to make sense of the Bible. Otherwise, it can cause heresy and heartache. And then the language gets very direct as our leader addresses the repercussions following one of these bombardments. He says, the police realize that this is not the work of local Chinese Christians. They would not be this stupid. Ah, the clarity of candor. So they round up all the foreign Christians they know. Many of them will be teachers or businessmen. They assume these believers are the ones responsible. They harass them, and in some cases they deport them. And the Chinese leader suggests an alternative methodology, and this is the key. If you really want to spread Jesus, then come and spread the gospel his way. Live here, learn Chinese, love the people, incarnate into the culture as Christ incarnated himself into humanity. And then, speaking to the tremendous interest in spirituality of all kinds in China today, the leader gives a caution. He says, like all kinds of organic growth, you can't hurry it. People take time to grow up as Christians. There's no fast track. There's no technology to speed up discipleship, and no quick fix method. This story, it came to us via Time magazine under the heading, When the Smugglers Are Working for Jesus. And our leader's final comment refers to that title. He said, I want to suggest to those brothers and sisters, you might be smuggling for yourselves, not for Jesus. Be careful your desire to smuggle is not merely a wish to have an adventure, to be James Bond for Jesus. Jesus does not need James Bond. He needs servants. Folks, he just as well might have said, guys, it's not about you. We need to continue to be servants, humble stewards of the gospel entrusted to us. And our God will continue to be sovereign. Certainly, we can be sure of that. And at the end, that is our hope for today and all of our tomorrows. I thank you. Thank you so much. It's a little warm in here, isn't it? Lights. How come you're not sweating? Questions for which there may be answers, and there are mics. And we need to have you use the mics because these things get picked up and all of this ends up in a book. Any questions? None? Okay, let's get out of here. Sir.
Thank you very much for your challenging presentation. It was certainly soul-searching. Thank you for the challenge and the call to be engaged. Your stories, of course, are very relevant because it shows that different approaches have good damage. I have several questions, but I'll just stop with that. I was just wondering about your impression of the Jesus film and the Passion, the Jesus film and the Passion film. Do you think these are direct from